Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Future in Review podcast. I'm Berit Anderson, the COO of Future in Review. So for those of you who've never heard of Future in Review before, we run the annual FIRE conference, which is coming up November 6th through 9th, 2023 in Rancho Palos Verdes, California at the Terranea Resort. The Economist has called FIRE the best technology conference in the world. And when we're not organizing that, the other arm of our business, Strategic News Service, provides its subscribers with the most accurate source of information about the future of technology and the global economy. So if you enjoy these video updates that we do, we hope that you will sign up for a trial of the Strategic News Service Global Report at the link below this video. And today I am back talking with Evan Anderson, who is the CEO of INVNT IP. He is an analyst for the Strategic News Service Global Report, and he has written this week about chips. His piece is called Chips Ahoy, which, as anyone else who appreciated the chocolate chip cookies as a child will appreciate. And we are talking today a little bit more about that piece. So Evan, in your most recent report, you talk about the shift towards building big new fabs in the US for silicon. Why is that happening? Who's doing it? And will it work? Clearly, there's a chip shortage, I should say. We should preface all of this by saying the reason we're talking about this is that there's a massive shortage of chips in the world.
Well, there's a couple aspects to the piece this time around this week. Obviously, we cover chips as much as we think is reasonable because they are absolutely critical to the global economy. So I talked about that a fair amount this week, and the reason that we're seeing so much reshoring, particularly into the United States, of fabs, that has been covered, I think, very well in the news cycle. As everybody realized during the pandemic, in part because of all those really bad supply chain issues and deep shortages, all of our chips are essentially coming from one place, and that's Taiwan. So TSMC is the absolute gold standard. I talked a little bit about it in the piece, but we actually had an earlier piece about TSMC and ASML, which makes the actual high-tech equipment that helps to cut wafers. Both of those companies pretty much own that world. I don't think that's changing anytime soon. And then, of course, the reason that TSMC has agreed to move some production into the United States has got a lot more to do with national security and supply chain security.
Fear of invasion.
Particularly given the kind of increased brinksmanship by the PRC about whether they will do something to Taiwan. So what's interesting is that that's all kind of happening, cranking along as one might expect, given the current political atmosphere, and given that the U.S. is putting money into helping build new fabs and has a strong interest in building new fabs. What's interesting is that those new fabs are in Arizona. And so TSMC, there was a piece out in the New York Times this week, or a week ago perhaps, that was talking about how there's a fair amount of consternation, I think, inside TSMC staff about doing that. That makes sense because I think they're encountering a number of different issues, right? So it's difficult.
Are the issues related to Arizona, or is it related to the US?
I think they're both. So I would guess, without knowing enough about specific issues inside, they've just raised their investment amount from 12 billion to 40, and that's impressive.
That's an increase.
I think it's also a response to the fact that everything, and actually the New York Times piece, we could post a link to it. It was good. It seems like everything is more expensive than perhaps they had planned, and that does not surprise me too much. The regulatory environment in the US is very different. So it's going to be, everything takes longer, permits take longer, et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting to me is that Arizona was chosen over another place, and we can get more into this later, but Intel
Ohio has also been a lot of the Midwest has been kind of a target for this kind of thing for Intel, for example, right? There was a major, the CHIPS Act had a major kind of earmark for Intel in there to start building.
So Intel also has a campus in Arizona, and they're expanding capacity there as well. The reason that that's interesting compared to a place like Ohio, and actually Google has a new project we can touch on later that's in Minnesota, and that makes a little bit more sense too, because these things take a lot of water, right? So that's a big issue in a Southwest state
that doesn't have any,
that is currently encountering serious problems with their water supply. one interesting aspect of that is, and I am no expert, so I will not get too deep into it or say a bunch of things I don't understand, but my basic understanding of Arizona's water is that part of the reason that there are issues with the supply from the Colorado is, in fact, that there are not too many restrictions on how much water you can use and when. But that has been the case,
In what state? In Arizona
yeah,
or in
up to
Colorado?
now. I think that has been the case up to now. What happens next is likely to be very different, right? Because the level of the Colorado has gotten to a dangerous low, and there are now open discussions in Arizona about what to do about that. From what I've seen, it sounds like there's a lot of argument, not a lot of agreement,
Mhm.
and that also makes sense because no one has, a
Shocker.
particular incentive to
Usually
use less
humans are
water
so
and
good at figuring things
let
out
someone else use
collaboratively.
more. Yeah. So that I think is going to be a really interesting factor moving forward. I think if we're building out massive fab capacity in Arizona and the water is low, that could be a big stick in the mud for our capability to produce silicon again back in US territory.
So let's talk about, you mentioned TSMC. We talked a little bit about Intel briefly, but you also wrote about some of these larger US companies that are getting into chips, Apple, Google, and Microsoft, namely. What are those companies doing, and how are their strategies different from like a TSMC or an Intel?
Yeah, and their categories are different as well. So there's a very interesting dynamic emerging here, which is going to be really, really relevant for both, the success of those companies, and we'll get into which companies I'm referring to in a second, but also for stock prices, et cetera. And that is, there is a kind of an emerging thing going on where big US tech companies are realizing that perhaps they don't need someone else to make their chips. Now, TSMC and companies
Now,
like
which kinds
ASML.
of which kinds of chips are we talking about here? 'Cause
Yeah,
there's
I'll go bit by bit because it depends on which, company you're talking about. But TSMC and ASML, companies like that, they're providing precursors to chips. They're providing the stuff you need to make the chips. Companies like Intel, companies like Broadcom and Qualcomm, for a long time have taken those things, those precursors, they manufacture the silicon, but then they actually make the chipsets that go into devices.
Mhm.
Um, that's a really, really big business. That's a, multi-billion-dollar business, for a number of different companies. And what we're seeing now is that big tech companies that used to buy those chipsets and put them into a phone and sell them along have apparently come to the conclusion that they actually can probably do that themselves. In fact, it's, as many people probably are aware, it's actually more than that. Apple's already doing it. So we'll start with Apple. Apple created their M1 chip set, and that replaced Qualcomm and Broadcom tech, but they're also doing it for all their different devices. So from, desktops to laptops to pads, they're creating all of their own chipsets, for a number of different categories of things. That's a big deal if you're Broadcom or Qualcomm. Like I think it was the Snapdragon chipset that they were using for iPhones. That's a huge market, and Apple's already well along the way. So they're actually leading, as far as I can see, by far over any other company. And that kind of makes sense. People talk about Tim Cook and his, extreme strength being supply chains. So that's one way to simplify your supply chain and save a lot of money. And in fact, it does appear
Right.
that they are saving a lot of money. It even appears that they've been able to avoid hiking prices on their devices at times because they're making their own, and they've kind of cut out the middleman there.
So the
So
middleman
that's,
in this case being like a Qualcomm, would Intel fit into that category as well?
yeah, although Apple was, I think, particularly reliant on Qualcomm.
Okay.
But Intel also was supplying a large number of chipsets for Google. So let's move to Google now. Google is doing a similar but different thing. And their whole move appears to be an open source kind of move, which is very different, in terms of the potential ramifications for revenue. And I thought it was interesting that they would be so focused on open source, um, instead of trying to create kind of a walled garden of their own, chipset IP that they could then sell on. And then I realized that it made a little bit more sense when you look at it from the perspective of Google being a very platform type company.
Right.
And
That's
so they're
what I was
looking at,
thinking, is if you can bring in enough developers to help your chip evolve over time.
yeah, so they have a whole new open source program, and they're going to do chips on demand is essentially the thing, right? So you can come in with your own design, or you can use one of these open source designs for all sorts of different applications. And they're actually partnering with a number of different companies, including, so there's a new program, a Google funded program in Minnesota to produce 200 nanometer wafers, and that's, they're going to be focused on all sorts of different things. They're very clearly targeting the market for AI and for quantum. So that's interesting, right? Interesting play. And then they've got a number of other partners that are apparently part of their open source programs that you can come in with a design or use someone else's design and then have a chip on order for a specific purpose. So
Not too dissimilar from the way that they rolled out Gmail, right? Like your email is free, but we're going to read all of your
exactly. They're a platform. They're a platform company, so they want to be the library of chip designs, and then they get a piece of that market by essentially providing you with those designs and then doing chips on demand for specific purposes, which is also very interesting. Also, still cuts out Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom. So these companies are taking big hits here, right? And Google has their Pixels coming out without, these Wi-Fi and other chipsets that were being used that were from Intel and from Broadcom and Qualcomm. So that's going to be a big deal for those companies. And then let's do one more. So Microsoft, let's say Google is following Apple, but doing their kind of version of it. And they're actually only just starting to kind of replace the middlemen here, about a year behind Apple.
Okay.
Apple started this process 2 years ago and is now deep into the newest versions of their M2. So they're really just iterating now on their own designs. And by the way, a lot of these are done in concert with ARM, so that's going to be a big boon to them. So
Right.
Get rid of the old companies, work with ARM, make your own chips. Microsoft is doing something different, and it's just starting, so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But they just recently acquired a company that's focused on DPUs, data processing units. And so that was a small company. It's not, I think it was called Fungibility, but it's not like that's going to be a really big deal in the next 6 months. But it appears that their play is more on data storage, and it makes sense when you think about Azure, right? So if they're trying to do a big play in cloud storage, then they're looking they're looking for a niche in what kind of chipsets they want to make. Then they're focused on data storage. So everybody's kind of, that's a lot of big companies moving away from being customers of these other really big companies. This is like a pretty big tectonic plate shift in the entire chipset market. And just to circle back briefly, like Apple is going to, as Tim Cook just gave a speech, they're going to be sourcing some of this stuff out of Arizona, right? So there's just a lot going on here. In terms of the broader effects, what we're seeing is that it's going to be a really, really tough time for companies like Broadcom, Qualcomm, and Intel.
Right.
Intel actually, as you mentioned, is clearly already starting to kind of respond to that, and they've got some plans. We won't get into it now, but that's a big deal. That these are billions and billions in revenues that we're talking about. Either they're going to the companies that we're having to spend them now, and they get to keep that money, or they're going to be shifted around. So like if I'm Apple, then I'm getting a huge amount of revenue that I'm retaining that I used to have to spend on costs, inputs to production, essentially, for my devices. If I'm Google, I'm trying to get a cut, and I'm splitting it with a couple other companies that I'm working with to do this kind of chip on demand thing.
So I would imagine that like in the short term, in the near term, there's like a much higher cost of investment needed to start these things up.
Sure, yeah.
But that over time that starts to play out and reduce costs.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess the way to look at it would be, and Apple's already kind of through this, and so they're already seeing the benefits. So you would imagine
as long as the Colorado River doesn't dry up.
Yeah, if the Phoenix thing does not work out, then that could be a big problem if they're planning on sourcing from there. Although that's a different problem because they may just have to not source from Arizona if you can't make chips in Arizona, right? If you can't make wafers in Arizona. But the underlying point here is that these companies, as they succeed or don't succeed at these things, will either be even bigger than ever before and in a big way, right? They'll make a lot more money, and these are companies that are already making a lot of money. Or if it fails, then it will have been a very expensive failure. So that's one of the interesting aspects.
I'm curious, we talked about the risks to Qualcomm and Broadcom and Intel. I'm sure their CEOs are spending a lot of time thinking about those things now. It sounds like ARM is in a good position overall to benefit from this development. Can you tell me a little bit more, if you had to pick like the most likely victor from among those top 3 companies you just mentioned, Microsoft, Google, ARM, at this early juncture?
You mean Microsoft, Google, and Apple? Yeah, because
I'm sorry, I said ARM, but I meant Apple.
ARM wins because they're in the supply chain.
Right.
Right.
Got it.
And newly in the supply chain.
Right. And who are the other winners?
TSMC and ASML keep winning.
Okay.
And then TSMC's major problem is whether they end up spending far too much money in Arizona and then struggle to actually get production up. So that's a different question. I would say right now Microsoft is starting to play with the idea of jumping into GPUs, right? That wasn't a huge acquisition. So I would just say it's more temporal. Apple's well into this, and it seems to be working. And it's their own version.
And there's the whole concept of early mover advantage, right? Like,
yes. I think they're already experiencing early mover advantage. And so I think that would, be very positive for their valuation, even now. If you're ignoring the fact that they've just moved to make, cutting out a huge amount of expense, having their own chips that they can then sell around the world if they so choose, that's a pretty big deal. And that is a supply chain coup.
On the other hand, just to balance this list of winners and losers out, as we mentioned in a previous podcast conversation, much of their supply chain is still based in China, so that could be a major.
Yeah, they have other business concerns going on, right? They're not only doing this. They're a large company with a lot of different things going on, and so they could affect manufacturing interests in China. Right. You have to parse, although I think they're working on that as far as I can tell. And then, Google's just an interesting story. So they've got a completely different option essentially. And if they become the go-to platform with a couple key partners for making all sorts of different kinds of chips, that could be a big win. So I think the real thing to track there is it working? It's not that, it's going to work or not based on anything aside from actual performance of the program, right? So the real question is, can you move quickly into that business? And can you deliver products on time that people like and work for other companies? And in that case, you might be in a pretty interesting position if you're Google after a couple of years of this. So the idea that there would be a platform that I can go to, is even as a mid-sized company, for instance, and say, I want this kind of thing for my new AI solution, and I need it to be very specific, and I also like that someone designed this other design. It's easy to see how that could be extremely lucrative, right? It's not a bad idea, it's a good idea. And the question will be, I think, all about execution.
Well, those are 3 very interesting programs to watch. I'm sure we will be covering them more in the future. But in the meantime, if you want to read more about Apple, Google, Microsoft, their chip strategies, and what else is going on in the world of chips, you can subscribe to the Strategic News Service using the link below this video. Thanks so much, Evan.
Thank you.